You stand at the edge of the Qumran Plateau in 1947, looking down at the limestone cliffs pockmarked with caves, their openings like dark eyes watching the Dead Sea shimmer in the distance. You are not an archaeologist. You are a Bedouin shepherd boy named Mohammed Ed Dib, and you have just thrown a stone into one of these caves, hoping to startle a lost goat. Instead, you heard the sound of pottery breaking, a sound that would crack open 2,000 years of silence and reveal words that some believed should have remained buried forever. The scrolls you would pull from that cave over the following days were wrapped in linen, sealed in clay jars, preserved by the desert's relentless dryness. Among them were texts that would eventually be called the most important archaeological discovery of the 20th century. But tucked between the biblical manuscripts and community rules was something else entirely, fragments of a text called the Book of Enoch, a collection of visions and prophecies that had been deliberately excluded from the Jewish and Christian canons centuries earlier. The rabbis had deemed it too dangerous. The church fathers had called it apocryphal. Yet here it was, preserved by a community that had fled to the desert's edge. Who had chosen to save these particular words when they could have saved anything else? You cannot read the ancient Hebrew and Aramaic scripts covering these brittle sheets of parchment and papyrus. You have no idea that within these fragments lies a cosmology that describes angels descending to earth, mating with human women, and teaching humanity forbidden knowledge, metallurgy, cosmetics, astrology, and the arts of war. You don't know that these texts speak of a final judgment, of the corruption of the natural order, and of celestial watchers who abandoned their posts to interfere with human destiny. All you know is that these scrolls might be valuable, and that the antiques dealer in Bethlehem might give you money for them. But let us step back from that cave mouth and ask a question that archaeologists, theologians, and scholars would debate for decades. Why did the Qumran community, likely Essenes, a Jewish sect that had retreated from the corruption of Jerusalem's temple establishment, choose to preserve the Book of Enoch alongside their biblical texts? What did they see in these visions that seemed essential enough to warrant the painstaking labor of copying by hand, of storing in sealed jars, of hiding in caves as Roman legions marched through Judea in 70 CE? The Book of Enoch itself is named after a figure who appears briefly in Genesis, the great-grandfather of Noah, described in just 2 verses as a man who walked with God, and then was no more, because God took him. This cryptic disappearance, not death, but translation to another realm, became the foundation for an entire apocalyptic literature that flourished in the centuries before the Common Era. The complete text, preserved in its entirety only in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church's canon, tells the story of Enoch's journey through the heavens, where he witnesses the workings of the cosmos and receives visions of humanity's future. The portion that appears in the Dead Sea Scrolls focuses particularly on the Watchers, a group of 200 angels who, according to the text, descended to Mount Hermon in the days before the flood. Their leader, Azazel, taught humans to make swords and knives and shields. Shemi-Hazza taught them enchantments and root cutting. Armaros taught the resolving of enchantments. Barakul taught astrology. Kokabal taught the constellations. These were not abstract theological concepts to the people who preserved these texts. These were explanations for the origin of civilization's double-edged gifts: technology that could heal or harm, knowledge that could illuminate or corrupt. You might imagine the scribes of Qumran working by oil lamp in their scriptorium, copying these words onto fresh parchment around the time that Jesus of Nazareth walked the roads of Galilee, just 50 miles to the north. They lived in a world saturated with Roman military technology, with roads and aqueducts and siege weapons that represented both the apex of human engineering and the instruments of oppression. They watched as the temple in Jerusalem became increasingly entangled with political power, as the priesthood collaborated with Roman governors, as the ancient covenant seemed to bend and break under the weight of empire. In this context, the Book of Enoch offered something that the canonical texts did not: a clear explanation for why the world seemed fundamentally broken, and a promise that this brokenness had been witnessed and would be judged. The text describes how the Watchers' interference with humanity led to the birth of the Nephilim, giants who consumed all the resources of the earth and then began to devour humanity itself. The earth, according to Enoch, became corrupted, filled with violence and injustice, until creation itself groaned under the weight of this transgression. The parallel to first-century Judea was not subtle. The Qumran community saw themselves as living in a similarly corrupted time, where forbidden knowledge in the form of Hellenistic culture and Roman law had infiltrated Jewish society, where giants in the form of the Roman military machine consumed the resources and lives of the people, where the natural order established by God seemed overturned by imperial power. They copied the Book of Enoch because it spoke to their present reality with the voice of ancient prophecy. But the preservation of these texts at Qumran represents only one thread in the Book of Enoch's strange journey through history. Before it was sealed in those caves, it had already traveled from its likely composition in the 3rd or 2nd century BCE through Jewish communities in Judea and the diaspora. After the Roman destruction of Jerusalem, when the rabbis who survived gathered to determine which texts would be authoritative for post-Temple Judaism, the Book of Enoch was deliberately excluded. The reasons remain debated, but likely included its elaborate angelology, its detailed cosmological speculations, and perhaps most importantly, its apocalyptic certainty about the imminent end of the present age, a certainty that had not been fulfilled despite generations of expectation. The early Christian church fathers had a more ambiguous relationship with the text. Jude, the epistle included in the New Testament, explicitly quotes from the Book of Enoch, treating it as authoritative prophecy. 2nd century Christian writers like Justin Martyr and Irenaeus referenced it approvingly. Tertullian in the 3rd century defended its authenticity. But by the 4th century, as the Church consolidated around an official canon and sought respectability within the Roman Empire, the Book of Enoch became problematic. Jerome, translating the Bible into Latin, dismissed it. Augustine questioned its authenticity. The text that had once circulated widely began to disappear from Western Christianity, surviving only in fragments, quotations, and references in other works. Yet in the highlands of Ethiopia, something different happened. When Christianity arrived in the 4th century, brought by Syriac missionaries, the Book of Enoch came with it. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church embraced the text as fully canonical, translating it into Ge'ez, the classical Ethiopian language, and preserving it through centuries when it vanished from European knowledge. Ethiopian monks copied and recopied the text in their scriptoria, painted its scenes in illuminated manuscripts, taught its contents to generations of believers. While European scholars knew of the Book of Enoch only through ancient references, Ethiopian Christians read it as scripture, recited it in liturgy, and shaped their understanding of cosmic history through its visions. This divergence in the text's reception, preserved in Ethiopia while rejected in Europe, hidden in caves by apocalyptic Jewish sectarians while excluded by mainstream rabbinical Judaism, quoted by early Christians but abandoned by later church authorities, already suggests something of its strange power. The Book of Enoch seemed to resonate most strongly with communities on the margins, with people who felt themselves to be witnesses to cosmic injustice, who needed a framework larger than conventional religious teaching to make sense of their suffering and their hope. The rediscovery of the text in the modern era began not in the caves of Qumran, but in the libraries of Ethiopia. In 1773, a Scottish explorer named James Bruce traveled to Ethiopia and returned to Europe with 3 Ge'ez manuscripts of the Book of Enoch. For the first time in over 1,000 years, European scholars could read the complete text. The initial translation into English appeared in 1821, and suddenly theologians, historians, and religious skeptics all had access to this long-lost apocalyptic vision. The timing of this rediscovery is worth noting. The early 19th century was a period of intense eschatological speculation in European and American Christianity. Movements like the Millerites in America were calculating the date of Christ's return based on biblical prophecies. Missionary societies were sending evangelists to every corner of the globe, motivated by the conviction that the gospel must be preached to all nations before the end could come. The Industrial Revolution was transforming human society at an unprecedented pace, creating both utopian hopes and apocalyptic fears. Into this charged atmosphere came a text that spoke of cosmic rebellion, fallen angels, forbidden knowledge, and divine judgment with a vividness and detail that the canonical Bible lacked. But it was the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in those Qumran caves, beginning with that broken pottery in 1947, that truly forced scholars to reckon with the Book of Enoch's significance. Here was proof that this text had not been merely a marginal curiosity, but had been valued and preserved by a Jewish community at the very moment when Christianity was emerging. The Qumran fragments included portions of at least 11 different copies of the Book of Enoch, more copies than were found of many biblical books. This community had considered these visions essential. When you examine the actual fragments discovered in those caves, held now in climate-controlled vaults, photographed under infrared light to reveal words invisible to the naked eye, studied with technologies that can identify individual scribal hands, you encounter something both mundane and extraordinary. These are words copied by human hands, using ink made from carbon and gall, onto animal skins, prepared through a process that required weeks of soaking, scraping, and stretching. Someone had to raise the sheep or goats. Someone had to slaughter them, carefully peel away the skins, process them into writing material. Someone had to prepare the ink, cut the reeds that served as pens, measure out the margins and lines on each sheet. Someone had to sit, perhaps for months, and copy each word from an older manuscript, maintaining concentration and accuracy through the tedious labor of transcription. Why go to all this trouble? Why expend these resources, the animals, the labor, the precious time, to preserve visions of fallen angels and cosmic judgment? The mundane details of scroll production make the urgency of the message more striking. The Qumran community was not wealthy. They lived in an arid wasteland where every drop of water had to be channeled, stored, rationed. They scratched out an existence on the margins of agricultural viability. Yet they chose to dedicate substantial resources to copying texts that their contemporaries in Jerusalem had rejected or forgotten. The answer, perhaps, lies in what they believed was happening in their historical moment. The decades leading up to the Roman destruction of Jerusalem were marked by increasing tensions, periodic revolts, apocalyptic fervor, and a widespread sense that the present order could not continue. Multiple messianic movements emerged, each claiming that the time of deliverance was at hand. The Qumran community, living in deliberate separation from the Jerusalem establishment, saw themselves as the faithful remnant, preserving true knowledge for the coming judgment. The Book of Enoch gave them a framework for understanding why the world seemed so broken, and a promise that this brokenness had been witnessed by God and would not stand forever. But here, standing at the edge of the Dead Sea in the present day, looking at the same cliffs where those scrolls lay hidden for nearly 2,000 years, a question emerges. What does it mean that this text has survived such a tortuous journey through history only to be read now? In a time when many of its concerns, about forbidden knowledge, about the corruption of the natural order, about technologies that seem to exceed human wisdom, feel strangely contemporary. The prophecies in the Book of Enoch are not specific predictions in the manner of later apocalyptic calculations. Instead, they describe patterns and conditions. A time when the powerful oppress the righteous, when the earth itself is polluted and damaged, when humanity has gained knowledge that exceeds its wisdom, when the boundaries between different orders of being become confused and violated. The text describes a world waiting for judgment, for correction, for the restoration of proper order. It speaks to communities who feel themselves powerless against larger forces, who witness injustice on scales that seem to require cosmic intervention to address. As the sun sets over the Dead Sea, turning the water copper and gold, you might wonder whether those shepherds who first pulled scrolls from these caves understood what they had found. They sold the texts to antiquities dealers who sold them to scholars who published them for the world. The scrolls themselves, those specific pieces of parchment handled by ancient scribes and modern Bedouins, now live in museums, viewed through glass by tourists who spend a few minutes before moving on to the next exhibit. But the words themselves, the visions of Enoch, the warnings of the watchers, the promises of judgment, those have been copied and translated and disseminated more widely than at any previous point in history. What was once hidden in caves is now available as a PDF download, accessible to anyone with an internet connection. What did the Qumran community believe would happen when these texts were finally read again? Did they imagine a distant future when their message would be needed? And what does it mean that we, living in that distant future, find ourselves reading about fallen angels teaching forbidden knowledge in a time when our own technological capabilities seem to be outpacing our wisdom, when the natural order seems increasingly disrupted, when powerful forces beyond individual control shape the conditions of life on Earth? The parallels are uncomfortable, perhaps too convenient, yet they persist in the minds of those who encounter this ancient text anew. But before we can explore those contemporary resonances, we need to understand more fully what the Book of Enoch actually says, how it was understood by those who preserved it, and how its warnings about the Watchers and their forbidden teachings have echoed through different historical moments. We need to follow the text beyond the caves, beyond the early church fathers who quoted it and then abandoned it, beyond even the Ethiopian highlands where it survived. We need to see how each generation that encountered these ancient words found in them a mirror for their own time, a warning that seemed written specifically for their moment in history. And we need to ask whether that pattern continues, whether we are simply the latest community to project our own anxieties onto an ancient text, or whether the Book of Enoch has something specific to say to a world where the boundaries between human and machine, between natural and artificial, between wisdom and mere knowledge, have become as blurred as the boundary between heaven and earth in Enoch's visions. The fragmentary nature of what was found at Qumran means that we have only pieces of the text, enough to confirm its antiquity and importance, but not enough to answer all our questions. Some sections are preserved in multiple copies, suggesting they were particularly valued. Other portions survive in only a few words on a fragment no larger than a coin. Scholars have spent decades trying to reconstruct the complete text by comparing the Qumran fragments with the Ethiopian version and with quotations in early Christian writings. What emerges from this painstaking work is not a single, definitive Book of Enoch, but rather multiple versions, layers of composition, different emphases depending on who was copying and why. This textual complexity itself tells a story. The Book of Enoch was not carved in stone, revealed once and forever fixed. It grew and changed, was edited and expanded, was adapted to speak to new situations even as it maintained its core visions. The question of which version is authentic misses the point. What matters is that for centuries, diverse communities found these texts essential enough to preserve, adapt, and transmit. And now, in our own time, the rediscovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls has given us access to the oldest surviving versions, allowing us to see what the Qumran community considered urgent enough to hide in caves as their world collapsed around them. You are standing in the British Museum in 1821, holding a freshly printed copy of Richard Lawrence's translation of the Book of Enoch from Ethiopian Ge'ez into English. The volume is modest, unassuming, bound in plain brown boards. You have no idea that you are holding something that will influence generations of religious thinkers, inspire poets and novelists, and provide ammunition for both biblical literalists and skeptics in their ongoing battles over scripture and science. You turn to chapter 6 and begin reading. And it came to pass, when the children of men had multiplied, that in those days were born unto them beautiful and comely daughters. And the angels, the children of heaven, saw and lusted after them, and said to one another, Come, let us choose us wives from among the children of men, and beget us children. The story that unfolds across the next several chapters is startling in its specificity and its implications. The text names the leaders of the rebellious angels Samjaza, Arakib, Ramiel Kokabil, Tamiel, Ramiel Danel, Ezkil Barkaijol, Asael, Armoros, Batariel Ananel, Zakiel Samsapiel, Sadarel Turel, Jamjel Sariel. 200 angels in total, the text claims, descended to Mount Hermon and swore an oath binding themselves together in this transgression. They took human wives, And from these unions came the Nephilim, beings of enormous size and appetites who consumed the resources of the earth and eventually began to consume humanity itself. But the corruption was not merely physical. The Watchers, according to the text, taught humanity knowledge that had been forbidden, secrets that belonged to the celestial realm alone. Azazel, one of the chief leaders, taught men to make swords and knives and shields and breastplates, and made known to them the metals of the earth and the art of working them. He taught women about cosmetics and beautification, about antimony and the beautifying of the eyelids, and all kinds of costly stones and all coloring tinctures. Shemihaza taught enchantments and root cuttings, the magical arts. Armoros taught the resolving of enchantments, counterspells, and protections. Barakajal taught astrology. Kokabel the constellations, Ezekiel the knowledge of clouds, Arakiel the signs of the earth, Shamsiel the signs of the sun, and Serial the course of the moon. These were not abstract theological points when Richard Lawrence published his translation. Britain in 1821 was in the midst of the Industrial Revolution's transformative power. The steam engine, invented decades earlier, was revolutionizing manufacturing, transportation, and the very fabric of daily life. Coal-powered factories were reshaping cities and populations. New chemical processes were creating dyes and materials that had never existed before. Astronomers were pushing deeper into the cosmos with ever larger telescopes. Geologists were uncovering an Earth history that extended far beyond biblical chronologies. The sciences of meteorology and astronomy were making the movements of weather and stars predictable, removing them from the realm of divine mystery. Into this moment of unprecedented technological and scientific advancement came a text suggesting that knowledge itself could be a form of corruption, that there were some things humanity was never meant to know, that the very technologies that promised to liberate and improve might actually represent a fundamental violation of cosmic order. The Book of Enoch insisted that metallurgy, the foundational technology of civilization from the Bronze Age forward, was not a human invention, but forbidden knowledge taught by fallen angels. Cosmetics and beautification, which might seem trivial, were grouped with weapons and astrology as forms of knowledge that corrupted human simplicity. Even the study of the heavens, which seemed noble and pure, was implicated in this original transgression. The implications were radical and uncomfortable. If the Watchers had taught humanity these arts, then civilization itself was built on a foundation of rebellion against the divine order. Progress was not progress at all, but a deepening corruption. Each new technology, each scientific discovery, each expansion of human capability could be read as a continuation of the original sin of the Watchers, the sin of teaching humanity things it was not meant to know. But you, reading this translation in 1821, might also notice something else in the text, a deep anxiety about knowledge that changes social order. When Azazel taught metallurgy, he did not just give humans the ability to forge tools. He gave them weapons, swords and knives and shields and breastplates, specifically military technology that allowed the strong to dominate the weak through organized violence. When he taught women about cosmetics and beautification, he introduced new forms of social competition and sexual display that, according to the text, disrupted previous social relations. The knowledge taught by the Watchers was not neutral. It created new hierarchies, new forms of power, new ways for some humans to control and exploit others. This critique would have resonated in an era when the Industrial Revolution was creating unprecedented wealth for factory owners, while driving former agricultural workers into urban slums where they labored in dangerous conditions for subsistence wages. The technologies of steam and steel were indeed creating new forms of power, economic, political, military, that concentrated in the hands of those who controlled the means of production. The beautiful machines that promised abundance also produced child labor, pollution, displacement, and a sense that human life itself was being reduced to a cog in a larger mechanism. The Book of Enoch's treatment of forbidden knowledge goes beyond simple technological determinism, however. The text is careful to note that the problem is not the knowledge itself, but its premature revelation to humanity. These are things that angels know. that belonged to the celestial realm, that humanity was perhaps meant to learn eventually, but not yet, not in this way. Not from rebellious teachers who acted out of lust rather than wisdom. The timing and the manner of transmission matter as much as the content. This distinction would become crucial in later theological debates. If some knowledge is inherently forbidden, then the pursuit of science becomes spiritually dangerous. But if the issue is one of readiness, of human wisdom being insufficient to handle certain kinds of knowledge, then the problem is not science itself, but the mismatch between capability and wisdom. The 19th century was full of examples of this mismatch: the ability to industrialize without the wisdom to protect workers or the environment, the ability to colonize without the wisdom to respect indigenous peoples, the ability to accumulate wealth without the wisdom to ensure its just distribution. The Book of Enoch describes the consequences of the Watchers' teachings in stark terms. The Nephilim, born of angel, human unions, became tyrants who consumed all the acquisitions of men, and then, when humanity could no longer sustain them, turned themselves against men in order to devour them. The earth became filled with violence and injustice. The natural order itself was corrupted, and all the others together with them took unto themselves wives, and each chose for himself one. And they began to go in unto them, and to defile themselves with them. And they taught them charms and enchantments, and the cutting of roots, and made them acquainted with plants, and they became pregnant, and they bare great giants, who consumed all the acquisitions of men. And when men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind. And they began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish, and to devour one another's flesh and drink the blood. This apocalyptic vision moves from social disruption, the teaching of forbidden knowledge, through economic exploitation, the consumption of human resources, to violence, giants turning against humanity, and finally to a complete breakdown of natural order, the mingling and devouring of different species. The progression suggests that the initial transgression, angels crossing the boundary between celestial and terrestrial realms, between immortal and mortal, sets in motion a cascade of boundary violations that culminates in total chaos. When you read these passages in 1821, you might think of the ongoing debates about slavery in the British Empire, which would be abolished in stages over the following decades. The image of powerful beings consuming the labor and lives of weaker humans, treating them as resources to be exploited until exhausted, had obvious contemporary resonance. You might think of colonial projects that treated indigenous peoples and lands as resources to be extracted, justified by claims of civilizational superiority that seemed to echo the giants' presumed right to consume humanity. You might think of the factory system's insatiable appetite for labor, of children working 12-hour days, of workers maimed by machines and then discarded. But the text offers more than just critique. It also promises judgment. Enoch's visions include detailed descriptions of the divine response to the Watchers' rebellion. The archangels observe the suffering on earth and bring it to God's attention. God responds by sending a series of judgments. The Watchers will be bound. Their children will be destroyed. The earth will be cleansed by flood, and only a righteous remnant, Noah and his family, will survive to begin again. The text gives Enoch himself a role in this drama, sending him to announce the judgment to the Watchers and to record everything he sees for future generations. This promise of judgment was enormously appealing to those who felt powerless in the face of social injustice. If the powerful seemed untouchable, if technology and industry seemed to operate by their own inexorable logic beyond human control, if the accumulation of wealth and power by a few was crushing the many, well, the Book of Enoch insisted that all of this had been seen, recorded, and judged by a higher authority. The current order was not permanent. The giants would fall. The Watchers would be bound. Justice would be restored. This eschatological hope animated many 19th century reform movements. Abolitionists fighting slavery, workers organizing for labor rights, women demanding suffrage. All of these movements drew on religious language that insisted the current unjust order would not stand forever. The Book of Enoch with its detailed account of rebellion, exploitation, and promised judgment, provided a narrative framework that validated these struggles. The powerful might seem invincible now, but they were like the Nephilim, destined for destruction once the judgment came. Yet there was a tension in this reading. The Book of Enoch's judgment is cosmic and complete. The flood destroys nearly everything. The world must be remade from scratch. This was not a model for incremental reform or for working within existing systems. It was apocalyptic in the fullest sense. It imagined total destruction followed by total renewal. For those who believed they were living in the end times, who expected the imminent return of Christ and the final judgment, this vision made sense. But for those trying to build actual movements to change actual societies, the all-or-nothing nature of Enochian judgment was both inspiring and paralyzing. The Book of Enoch also complicated the question of who was responsible for the world's corruption. In the canonical Genesis narrative, human sin begins with Adam and Eve's disobedience in eating the forbidden fruit. The blame lies squarely with humanity. But in Enoch's vision, the primary blame falls on the Watchers, celestial beings who rebel against their assigned role and corrupt humanity by teaching forbidden knowledge. Humanity appears almost as a victim, seduced and exploited by more powerful beings. This shift in blame had significant theological implications. If humanity's corruption came from outside, from supernatural teachers who deliberately led humans astray, then human nature itself was not fundamentally flawed. The problem was not original sin in the Augustinian sense, but rather original oppression, powerful beings using their knowledge to dominate and exploit weaker beings. This reading opened space for a more optimistic view of human potential. If the Watchers could be removed, if the giants could be destroyed, if the forbidden knowledge could be unlearned or its use constrained by wisdom, then perhaps humanity could return to a simpler, more innocent state. But there was a darker interpretation as well. If forbidden knowledge once taught could not be unlearned, then humanity was irredeemably corrupted. You cannot uninvent the sword. You cannot forget metallurgy. The knowledge of weapons and warfare, of manipulation and exploitation, of technologies that amplify human power beyond human wisdom, all of this had become part of human culture and could not simply be erased. Even after the flood, Noah and his descendants still possessed the knowledge that the Watchers had taught. The judgment destroyed the giants and bound the Watchers, but it did not remove the knowledge itself from human consciousness. This meant that every generation faced the same choice the first humans faced when the Watchers descended. What to do with knowledge that exceeds wisdom? How to live with technologies that can create abundance or destruction? How to organize societies when some people have access to forms of power, whether military, economic, or intellectual, that others lack? The Book of Enoch did not provide easy answers to these questions. It simply insisted that the questions themselves were ancient, that they had been observed and judged by divine authority, and that there would eventually be a reckoning. As you close Richard Lawrence's translation and set it back on the shelf, you might wonder why this text, so important in the centuries before the Common Era, had disappeared from Western Christianity for over 1,000 years. Why had the Church Fathers who initially quoted it so approvingly eventually decided it was too dangerous to include in the canon? What was it about the Book of Enoch's vision that became unacceptable? Part of the answer lies in the text's elaborate angelology and its detailed cosmological speculations. By the 4th and 5th centuries, as Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, the Church was working to consolidate doctrine, to create clear boundaries between orthodox and heretical belief. The Book of Enoch's detailed accounts of angelic hierarchies, of multiple heavens, of the mechanisms of divine judgment, all of this seemed to encourage speculation beyond what the canonical scriptures revealed. Church authorities worried that such speculation would lead believers away from simple faith and into complex mythologies that competed with official doctrine. But perhaps more troubling was the Book of Enoch's critique of power and knowledge. The text explicitly connected metallurgy, warfare, and social hierarchy with angelic rebellion and cosmic corruption. It suggested that the technologies and social structures of civilization itself were fundamentally tainted. This was an uncomfortable message for a church that was now allied with imperial power, that blessed the armies of Christian emperors, that accepted and even celebrated the sophisticated technologies of Roman civilization. To continue treating the Book of Enoch as scripture would require the church to maintain a critical distance from the very civilization it was now helping to govern. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church faced no such constraint. Christianity in Ethiopia never became a tool of empire in the way it did in Rome. Ethiopian Christians maintained a more apocalyptic and prophetic stance, seeing themselves as a faithful remnant, preserving true doctrine against corruptions elsewhere. The Book of Enoch is critique of power and its promise of judgment for the mighty fit naturally within this self-understanding. So the text survived in Ethiopia while it vanished from Europe, preserved by a community that still found its message urgent and relevant. When James Bruce brought those manuscripts back from Ethiopia in 1773, and when Richard Lawrence published his translation in 1821, they were reintroducing to European consciousness a text that European Christianity had deliberately forgotten. And the timing was significant. The 19th century, with its unprecedented technological changes and social upheavals, with its colonial projects and industrial revolutions, with its new forms of power and exploitation. This was precisely the kind of moment when the Book of Enoch's warnings about forbidden knowledge and its promises of judgment for the mighty might resonate anew. But the question remained, was the Book of Enoch's vision actually prophetic, speaking across millennia to warn of specific dangers? Or was it simply a flexible enough text that every generation facing technological change and social upheaval could read their own anxieties into its ancient words? Did the parallels between the Watcher's teaching of metallurgy and the Industrial Revolution's technological transformations represent genuine insight into repeating historical patterns, or were they merely coincidental similarities that readers projected onto the text? To answer these questions, we need to follow the Book of Enoch further into the 19th and 20th centuries to see how different communities interpreted its warnings, how its prophecies were applied to new situations, and how its survival and rediscovery at Qumran changed scholarly understanding of early Judaism and Christianity. We need to understand what it meant when the oldest surviving copies of this text were pulled from caves just as humanity was developing technologies: nuclear weapons, genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, that seemed to fulfill the text's warnings about knowledge that exceeds wisdom with uncanny precision. And we need to reckon with the uncomfortable possibility that the Book of Enoch's vision of corrupted knowledge and necessary judgment might be more than just ancient religious mythology, might actually describe something essential about the human relationship with power, knowledge, and technology that remains constant across millennia. You are sitting in a university library in 1952, 5 years after the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, reading the first scholarly publications about the Qumran fragments of the Book of Enoch. The war has ended. The concentration camps have been liberated, their horrors documented. The atomic bombs have fallen on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, demonstrating that humanity now possesses technology capable of destroying civilization itself. The Cold War is beginning, with its promise of mutually assured destruction. And here, in front of you, are photographs of ancient manuscripts describing a world corrupted by forbidden knowledge, where powerful beings taught humans to make weapons, where civilization devolved into violence, where the earth itself groaned under the weight of transgression. The parallels are not subtle. The 20th century had witnessed an acceleration of technological capability that would have seemed like magic to any previous generation. Flight, atomic energy, computers, antibiotics, television. The list of transformative technologies invented in just 5 decades is staggering. Each innovation promised to improve human life, to solve ancient problems, to liberate humanity from suffering and constraint. Yet the same technologies that could heal could also harm. The chemistry that produced synthetic fertilizers and life-saving medicines also produced poison gas and nerve agents. The physics that promised unlimited clean energy from splitting atoms also produced weapons that could incinerate cities. The organizational technologies that allowed for unprecedented economic productivity also enabled genocide on an industrial scale. The Book of Enoch seemed to describe exactly this pattern: knowledge that promised benefit but delivered corruption. Technologies that amplified human power beyond human wisdom, a widening gap between capability and moral understanding. When Azazel taught metallurgy, according to the text, he did not teach it to everyone equally. Some humans gained access to weapons and tools that gave them power over others. Social stratification followed technological innovation. Violence followed inequality. The text suggested a direct causal chain from forbidden knowledge to social breakdown to apocalyptic destruction. Scholars examining the Qumran fragments in the early 1950s were struck by the prominence of the Book of Enoch in the caves. As mentioned earlier, at least 11 copies had been found, more than many biblical books. This suggested that for the Qumran community, Enoch's visions were not marginal or optional, but central to their understanding of history, prophecy, and their own role in the cosmic drama. They saw themselves as living in the time described in Enoch's visions, a time when the corruption introduced by the Watchers had reached its peak and judgment was imminent. The Qumran community, likely Essenes, had withdrawn from mainstream Jewish society because they believed it had become irredeemably corrupt. The Temple in Jerusalem, the center of Jewish worship, had been compromised by collaboration with foreign powers. First the Seleucids, then the Romans. The priesthood had become a political office, bought and sold, no longer based on proper lineage or righteousness. The calendar itself, which determined when holy days should be observed, had been changed from the solar calendar that the Qumran community believed was correct to a lunar calendar that they considered a corruption. Even the most basic elements of religious life had been, in their view, twisted and defiled. In this context, the Book of Enoch provided a comprehensive explanation. The corruption was not merely human failure or political compromise. It was the continuation of a cosmic rebellion that began before the flood, when the Watchers descended and taught forbidden knowledge. The compromised priesthood, the collaborations with foreign powers, the adoption of Hellenistic culture, the military technologies of their Roman occupiers. All of this could be understood as the ongoing legacy of that original transgression. The Qumran community saw themselves as the righteous remnant preserving true knowledge while awaiting the judgment that would cleanse the earth. You examine the photographs of the Qumran fragments more closely. The writing is in Aramaic and Hebrew, using scripts that specialists can date paleographically to specific periods. Some fragments are from the 3rd or 2nd century BCE, making them among the oldest surviving biblical manuscripts. The parchment is brittle, darkened by age and the minerals of the cave environment. In some places the writing has faded almost to invisibility. In others it remains crisp and clear, as though written yesterday. Each fragment represents choices made by ancient scribes about what was important enough to preserve. One fragment contains a portion of the section describing Azazel's punishment. The archangel Raphael is commanded to bind Azazel hand and foot and cast him into the darkness, and make an opening in the desert, which is in Dudale, and cast him therein, and place upon him rough and jagged rocks, and cover him with darkness, and let him abide there forever, and cover his face that he may not see light. And on the day of the great judgment he shall be cast into the fire. This punishment, binding in darkness beneath rough stones, cut off from light, awaiting final destruction, was the fate decreed for the leader of the Watchers, who taught humanity the arts of war and manipulation. The text is explicit that this binding has already occurred, that Azazel and the other rebellious Watchers are even now imprisoned in darkness, unable to continue their direct interference with humanity. Yet their legacy remains. The knowledge they taught cannot be unlearned. The technologies they revealed continue to be used and elaborated. The social structures built on inequality and violence persist. This creates a theological problem that the text addresses explicitly. If the Watchers have been bound, why does evil continue? Why does the corruption they introduced still poison human society? The Book of Enoch's answer is that the spirits of the Nephilim, the giant offspring of the Watchers and human women, were released when their bodies were destroyed. These spirits, unlike their angelic fathers, were not bound. They remained free to roam the earth, causing mischief, leading humans into sin, perpetuating the corruption that the Watchers initiated. Demons, in this cosmology, are not fallen angels themselves, but the disembodied spirits of the Watchers' hybrid offspring, creatures that should never have existed, now condemned to wander without rest. This demonology provided ancient readers with an explanation for the persistence of evil, even after the Watchers were punished. It also maintained the text's insistence that the primary responsibility for corruption lay with the Watchers, not with humanity. Humans remained victims, still subject to the ongoing influence of the Nephilim spirits, even though the Watchers themselves were bound. This was simultaneously comforting. Humanity's essential nature was not corrupt and terrifying. Humanity remained vulnerable to supernatural forces beyond its control. For the scholars of the 1950s examining these fragments, the question was how to interpret this mythology in light of modern understanding. The discovery at Qumran proved that the Book of Enoch was not a late fabrication, but an authentic ancient Jewish text that had influenced early Christianity. But what did its mythology actually mean? Were the Watchers and Nephilim literal supernatural beings, or were they mythological representations of historical realities? One line of interpretation, favored by many mid-20th century scholars, read the Book of Enoch as a symbolic account of cultural exchange and conquest. The Watchers represented foreign influences, perhaps Mesopotamian, perhaps Hellenistic, bringing new technologies and cultural practices into Jewish society. The forbidden knowledge was the seductive appeal of foreign culture. With its advanced military technology, sophisticated cosmetics and luxury goods, its astrological religion and magical practices. The Nephilim represented the hybrid culture that resulted when traditional Jewish society was penetrated by these foreign influences. A culture that seemed powerful and attractive, but was fundamentally corrupted and corrupting. This reading had the advantage of demythologizing the text while preserving its critical force. The Book of Enoch became a prophetic critique of cultural assimilation, a warning against adopting the technologies and values of conquering empires, even when those technologies seemed beneficial. The text's insistence that certain knowledge was forbidden could be understood as a conviction that cultural integrity required maintaining boundaries, that not every innovation should be adopted simply because it was possible. But this interpretation also raised uncomfortable questions in the post-war era. The 20th century had witnessed the catastrophic consequences of cultural nationalism taken to extremes. Nazi Germany's ideology of racial and cultural purity had led to genocide. Soviet communism's attempt to create a new society by revolutionary transformation had produced gulags and mass starvation. The colonial powers' conviction of their own cultural superiority had justified exploitation and oppression across the globe. Could the Book of Enoch's vision of a pure remnant, preserving true knowledge against foreign corruption, be read as validation for this kind of exclusionary ideology? The Qumran community itself provided a troubling example. Their extreme sectarianism led them to withdraw from society entirely, to view all outsiders as corrupt, to wait for a violent judgment that would destroy everyone except themselves. They preserved sacred texts in caves, while living in deliberate poverty and isolation, convinced that engagement with the wider world would compromise their purity. When the Romans destroyed Jerusalem in 70 CE, the Qumran community apparently perished as well. Their settlement burned, their library hidden, but their way of life extinguished. Was this the inevitable outcome of taking the Book of Enoch's warnings too seriously? Did the text's apocalyptic vision necessarily lead to withdrawal? To the abandonment of attempts to reform society from within, to a passive waiting for divine intervention? Or was there another way to read the text that preserved its critical force without requiring sectarian isolation? You set down the scholarly journal and pick up another publication from the same period. A small book published by a religious group arguing that the Book of Enoch's prophecies are being fulfilled in the present moment, that the atomic bomb represents the ultimate expression of forbidden knowledge, that the mixing of nations through immigration and globalization represents a new form of the corruption that the Watchers introduced. The book is poorly printed, filled with charts attempting to correlate specific verses from Enoch with current events, with underlined passages and exclamation points, emphasizing the urgency of its message. This kind of apocalyptic interpretation had flourished throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, with each generation finding in the Book of Enoch confirmation that they were living in the end times. The First World War had seemed apocalyptic enough to convince many that judgment was imminent. The Spanish flu pandemic that followed killed more people than the war itself, adding to the sense that civilization was collapsing. The Great Depression suggested economic systems were failing. The Second World War, with its unprecedented destruction and genocide, seemed to confirm that evil had reached its peak. And now the atomic bomb promised that humanity possessed the means to fulfill the apocalyptic visions literally, to destroy the earth with fire just as Enoch had prophesied. Each of these interpretations shared a common assumption, that the Book of Enoch was primarily about the future, about predicting specific events that would signal the end times. Readers searched the text for clues about when and how the final judgment would come, what signs would precede it, what they should do to prepare. This approach treated the text as a kind of encoded message, a divine communication that required deciphering to reveal its true meaning. But this future-focused interpretation arguably missed the text's more immediate purpose. For the communities that originally composed and preserved the Book of Enoch, it was not primarily about predicting distant future events. It was about making sense of their present reality, about understanding why the world seemed so broken and unjust, about maintaining hope that this brokenness would not last forever. The text provided a narrative framework that validated their experiences of oppression and their conviction that a different order was possible. When the Qumran community read about the Watchers teaching forbidden knowledge, they thought about Roman military technology occupying their land. When they read about the Nephilim consuming all the acquisitions of men, they thought about imperial taxation that left them impoverished. When they read about the corruption of the temple, they thought about the high priesthood appointed by Rome. The text spoke directly to their lived experience, offering both explanation and hope. This pattern repeated throughout history. When 19th century workers read about powerful beings exploiting humanity, they thought about factory owners and industrial capitalism. When 20th century readers encountered warnings about forbidden knowledge, they thought about nuclear weapons and genetic engineering. The text remained relevant, not because it predicted specific future events, but because it described patterns of power, knowledge, and corruption that repeated across different contexts. Yet there was something genuinely prophetic in this repetition. The Book of Enoch insisted that certain patterns were fundamental to human history, that knowledge without wisdom leads to exploitation, that technology amplifies human power faster than human moral development, that those who gain access to new forms of power will use them to dominate others, that this process creates injustice on scales that eventually demand correction. These were not predictions of specific events but observations about structural dynamics that transcended any particular historical moment. By the mid-1950s, as you sit in that library reading about the Qumran discoveries, these structural dynamics had become impossible to ignore. The atomic bomb had demonstrated that humanity now possessed knowledge that genuinely could destroy civilization. The Holocaust had demonstrated that industrial organization and modern technology could be applied to genocide with horrifying efficiency. The Cold War promised that these capabilities would continue to expand, that the arms race would produce ever more powerful weapons, that the gap between human capability and human wisdom would continue to widen. The Book of Enoch's vision of watchers bound in darkness awaiting final judgment took on new resonance. The technologies of destruction had been created. They could not be uninvented. The knowledge of how to split atoms, how to organize genocide, how to manipulate human psychology through propaganda. All of this was now part of human consciousness. Like the fallen watchers, this knowledge had been bound by international agreements, by treaties limiting weapons testing, by the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, by the Nuremberg trials establishing that some actions were crimes against humanity regardless of national law. But also like the bound watchers, this knowledge remained latent, its potential for destruction merely constrained rather than eliminated. And the spirits of the Nephilim, the ongoing effects of this knowledge, the weapons that continued to exist, the ideologies that justified domination, the systems that concentrated power, these remained active, roaming the earth, influencing human choices, perpetuating the corruption that had been introduced. The binding of the Watchers had not eliminated evil, it had only limited its direct expression. The struggle continued, would continue, until some final reckoning that the text promised, but that remained frustratingly unscheduled. This ambiguity. The Watchers are bound, but their legacy persists. Judgment is certain, but its timing is unknown, created a complex ethical situation for believers. Should they withdraw from society like the Qumran community, maintaining purity while awaiting divine intervention? Or should they engage with the corrupted world, working to limit the damage, to constrain the use of forbidden knowledge, to build structures of justice, even within a fundamentally compromised system? The Book of Enoch itself did not clearly answer this question. The text focused on describing the corruption and promising judgment, not on prescribing how the righteous should live in the meantime. Different communities read different ethical implications into this silence. Some embraced withdrawal and waiting, others embraced active resistance. Still others embraced reform from within, attempting to use the very technologies and systems that the text seemed to condemn for constructive, rather than destructive purposes. You notice that the sun has set while you've been reading. The library windows are dark, reflecting your own image back at you. You are sitting in a building lit by electricity, reading documents photographed with cameras and printed with mechanical presses, accessing knowledge that has been preserved through technologies that the ancients could not have imagined. The Book of Enoch, which warned about forbidden knowledge, has been preserved and disseminated by precisely the kinds of technologies it might have considered suspicious. This irony is inescapable. To read the text at all requires participating in the civilizational project that the text critiques. To study it academically requires accepting that human knowledge can be pursued systematically, that historical texts can be analyzed objectively, that ancient myths can be understood in their original contexts rather than as literal prophecies. Yet the scholars doing this work in the 1950s, many of them, were also deeply aware that the text's warnings about knowledge exceeding wisdom had never been more relevant. The question that emerges from this paradox is whether the Book of Enoch is calling for the rejection of knowledge altogether, or for a different relationship with knowledge, one characterized by humility, by awareness of limitations, by ethical constraints on application. The text describes what the Watchers taught and the consequences that followed, but it does not explicitly condemn all technology or all science. It condemns the teaching of this knowledge by rebellious angels to unprepared humanity, the use of this knowledge without wisdom, the amplification of human power without corresponding moral development. If this is the correct reading, then the Book of Enoch's prophecy is not about the inevitable destruction that follows from knowledge itself, but about the necessary judgment that follows when knowledge is pursued without wisdom, when capability exceeds understanding, when power is exercised without justice. The question for any generation encountering this text is not whether to reject knowledge, but how to pursue it responsibly, how to ensure that wisdom keeps pace with capability, how to build structures that constrain the misuse of power, even when that power is available. The binding of the Watchers in this reading becomes a model for how humanity might constrain its own worst impulses. The fallen angels who taught forbidden knowledge are not destroyed immediately but bound, imprisoned. Their ability to cause direct harm limited even as their legacy persists. Perhaps this suggests that the knowledge they taught, the technologies they revealed, cannot be eliminated but can be constrained, regulated, surrounded with safeguards that limit their destructive potential while preserving their constructive uses. But the text also insists that this binding is temporary, that it delays rather than prevents the final judgment. The watchers remain imprisoned until the day of the great judgment, when they will be cast into the fire. This suggests that mere constraint is not sufficient, that the corruptions introduced by forbidden knowledge require more than regulation. They require fundamental transformation, a cleansing judgment that addresses the root causes rather than merely managing the symptoms. As you leave the library and walk through streets lit by electric lamps, past cars powered by internal combustion engines, under skies crossed by airplanes carrying passengers at speeds that would have seemed impossible a century earlier, you carry with you the images of those Qumran fragments, ancient scribes working by oil lamp to preserve warnings about forbidden knowledge, modern scholars working by electric light to understand those warnings, and you yourself, reading about all of this through technologies that amplify human capability to preserve and disseminate information beyond anything the ancients could have imagined. The Book of Enoch insists that you are living in a world shaped by knowledge that was taught too soon, by technologies that exceed wisdom, by powers that have been constrained but not eliminated. It promises that this situation will not continue forever, that judgment is coming, that the current order will be overturned and replaced. But it does not tell you when this judgment will arrive, or what you should do while waiting, or whether your own work, your own use of the technologies and knowledge that surround you, contributes to the corruption or to the resistance against it. These questions follow you into the night, as urgent and unresolved as they were for the Qumran community 2,000 years earlier, as they have been for every community that has encountered this text and recognized in its ancient words a mirror of their own time. The prophecy continues, not because it predicts specific future events, but because it describes patterns that recur. Because each generation faces anew the question of what to do with knowledge that exceeds wisdom, with power that surpasses justice, with capabilities that outpace moral understanding. And the Book of Enoch continues to insist across millennia that these questions matter, that they have been observed, that they will be judged, that the current order is not the only possible order, and that those who preserve this awareness, who maintain their critical consciousness even within corrupted systems, play an essential role in the larger drama of history. You are scrolling through your phone in 2024, reading news articles about artificial intelligence, about algorithms that can generate convincing text and images, about systems that can analyze human behavior and predict decisions, about technologies that their own creators admit they don't fully understand and cannot completely control. A headline catches your attention. AI researchers warn of existential risk from technologies they are developing. You pause. You think about the watchers teaching forbidden knowledge. You think about capabilities exceeding wisdom. You think about the Book of Enoch's warning that some knowledge, once taught, cannot be unlearned, and that the consequences of that teaching can persist for generations. The parallels are uncomfortable and perhaps too neat. Every generation has read its own anxieties into the Book of Enoch. Victorian readers saw the Industrial Revolution. Mid-20th century readers saw nuclear weapons. Surely you are doing the same thing. Projecting contemporary concerns about artificial intelligence onto an ancient text that cannot possibly have been about neural networks and machine learning. And yet the pattern persists. Researchers developing artificial intelligence systems acknowledge that these systems learn in ways their creators don't fully understand, that they develop capabilities that weren't explicitly programmed, that they sometimes behave in unexpected ways that can be beneficial or harmful. The knowledge of how to build these systems has been taught, shared through research papers, implemented in code, deployed in products that billions of people use daily. Like metallurgy in the ancient world, AI has become foundational to civilization in remarkably few years. And like metallurgy, it is a technology that amplifies human power in ways that can be used for construction or destruction. The Book of Enoch describes a moment when powerful beings gave humanity knowledge before humanity was ready to use it wisely. The AI researchers' warnings sound remarkably similar. We have created systems whose full implications we don't understand, whose capabilities are advancing faster than our ability to ensure they will be used safely, whose deployment is driven by competitive pressures that override caution. The knowledge of how to build increasingly capable AI systems is spreading globally, impossible to contain now that the fundamental approaches have been published and demonstrated. Multiple nations and corporations are racing to develop more powerful systems, driven by the conviction that falling behind means losing strategic advantage. Precisely the dynamic that the Book of Enoch suggests inevitably follows from the introduction of militarily relevant knowledge. You set down your phone and think about the other technologies that have emerged in recent decades. Genetic engineering that allows for the modification of human embryos. Surveillance systems that can track individuals, movements, and communications with unprecedented precision. Social media platforms that can manipulate human psychology at scale. Autonomous weapons systems that can select and engage targets without human oversight. Each of these technologies was developed with promises of benefit: curing disease, preventing crime, connecting communities, reducing casualties. Each has also revealed capacity for misuse, for concentration of power, for amplification of existing inequalities. This is the pattern the Book of Enoch describes. Knowledge is never neutral. Technologies that can heal can also harm. Capabilities that can liberate can also oppress. The Watchers taught metallurgy, which could be used to make plowshares or swords. They taught cosmetics, which could beautify or deceive. They taught astrology, which could reveal cosmic patterns or justify fatalism. The knowledge itself was ambiguous. Its effects depended on how it was used, by whom, for what purposes, within what structures of power and accountability. The text's insistence that this knowledge was forbidden suggests that some capabilities should not be pursued regardless of their potential benefits, that there are boundaries that should not be crossed even when crossing them is possible. This is a deeply uncomfortable claim in cultures that valorize innovation, that assume that knowledge is always good, that believe technological progress is synonymous with human advancement. The Book of Enoch stands as a counter-tradition, insisting that some knowledge corrupts, that some capabilities should remain undeveloped, that the pursuit of power without corresponding wisdom leads inevitably to catastrophe. But what would it mean to take this warning seriously in the present? Should research into artificial intelligence be halted, the knowledge suppressed, the capabilities limited? This seems both impossible and potentially counterproductive. The knowledge has already been taught. The technologies have already been deployed. Attempting to suppress them at this point might simply ensure that they continue to develop in secret, without public scrutiny or democratic oversight, concentrated in the hands of whoever is willing to ignore the prohibitions. This is the situation the Book of Enoch describes after the Watchers have been bound. The knowledge they taught remains, circulating through human culture, its effects persisting even though its original teachers are imprisoned. The question is not how to unteach what has been taught, but how to live with knowledge that exceeds wisdom, how to constrain its most destructive applications, how to build structures that promote its beneficial uses while limiting its capacity for harm. The text suggests that this kind of constraint is possible but temporary, that it delays rather than prevents the final crisis. The Watchers remain bound until the day of judgment. The implication is that merely constraining dangerous knowledge is not sufficient, that the fundamental corruption it introduces can only be addressed through transformation that goes beyond regulation and reform. Yet the text also suggests that this period of constraint, however temporary, is necessary, that the binding of the Watchers serves a purpose, even if it does not resolve the underlying problem. You think about the international agreements that currently constrain the most dangerous technologies. Treaties limiting nuclear weapons testing and proliferation. Agreements prohibiting chemical and biological weapons. Emerging frameworks for regulating genetic engineering and artificial intelligence. These are attempts to bind dangerous capabilities, to limit their development and use, to create structures of accountability that extend beyond national borders. They are imperfect, often violated, subject to the pressures of geopolitical competition. Yet they represent an acknowledgement that some knowledge requires constraint, that unfettered technological development poses existential risks, that wisdom must somehow catch up to capability. The Book of Enoch would likely see these efforts as necessary but insufficient. Necessary, because without constraint the corruption spreads unchecked. Insufficient, because they address symptoms rather than causes, because they assume that technical fixes can solve problems that are fundamentally moral and spiritual, because they operate within systems of power that are themselves part of the corruption that needs addressing. This tension between the necessity of working within existing systems and the inadequacy of merely reforming those systems has characterized every community that has taken the Book of Enoch seriously. The Qumran sect chose withdrawal, maintaining purity, while waiting for divine intervention. Early Christian communities chose active proclamation, announcing the coming judgment while building alternative communities that modeled different ways of living. Ethiopian Christians chose preservation, maintaining the text and its worldview even as they engaged with the wider world. 19th century reformers chose resistance, organizing movements to overturn unjust structures while drawing on apocalyptic hopes that those structures would eventually fall. Each approach contains insight and limitation. Withdrawal maintains critical distance, but abandons those still suffering within corrupted systems. Proclamation announces the problem, but may not create concrete change. Preservation maintains memory and hope, but can become merely commemorative. Resistance works for change, but may become compromised by the systems it seeks to transform. The Book of Enoch itself does not prescribe a single response, perhaps because no single response is adequate to the complexity of living in a world where forbidden knowledge has been taught and cannot be unlearned. What the text does insist upon, consistently and urgently, is that the situation is not normal, that the current order is fundamentally corrupted, that the injustice and suffering visible everywhere are not natural or inevitable, but the result of specific transgressions that will be judged and corrected. This insistence serves multiple functions. It validates the experience of those who suffer under unjust systems. Your suffering is real, it has been seen. It matters. It challenges the legitimacy of existing power structures. The powerful are not naturally superior or divinely ordained, but are beneficiaries of corruption. It maintains hope. The current order will not last forever. Judgment is coming. Transformation is possible. These functions remain relevant wherever people experience oppression, wherever power concentrates in ways that create suffering, wherever technological capabilities exceed moral wisdom. The Book of Enoch continues to speak because the patterns it describes continue to recur. Powerful actors gain access to knowledge or capabilities that they use to dominate others. This creates inequality that is justified through ideology. The powerful deserve their power because they are superior, more advanced, more rational. Those who resist are marginalized, dismissed, persecuted. Yet the corruption spreads, the injustice becomes unsustainable, and the promise of judgment, whether through revolution, collapse, or divine intervention, remains as both threat and hope. You return to your phone and the article about AI researchers' warning of existential risk. One researcher is quoted, "We are creating systems with capabilities that exceed our understanding. We don't know how to align them with human values. We don't know how to ensure they will remain under human control. Yet we continue to develop more powerful systems because we're afraid that if we don't, someone else will, and they might not be as careful as we're trying to be." This is the dynamic that the Book of Enoch describes. The Watchers taught forbidden knowledge not out of altruism, but out of lust. They wanted human women and taught their secrets as a form of seduction and domination. Once one group of Watchers began teaching, the others felt compelled to do the same or risk being left behind. The knowledge spread through competition and desire, not through careful consideration of consequences. And humanity, receiving this knowledge from powerful beings who seemed wise and beneficial, incorporated it into civilization without fully understanding the long-term effects. The researchers developing AI find themselves in a similar situation. Most of them genuinely want their work to benefit humanity. They are not deliberately trying to create catastrophic risks. Yet they are caught in competitive dynamics, between corporations, between nations, between research labs, that drive them to develop increasingly powerful systems faster than they can ensure those systems will be safe. The knowledge of how to build these systems is spreading through publication and implementation, making it available to actors with fewer scruples and fewer resources for safety research. The race continues, capabilities expand, and the gap between what the systems can do and what anyone fully understands about how they work grows wider. The Book of Enoch would recognize this pattern. It is the pattern of the Watcher's descent, of forbidden knowledge taught before humanity was ready, of power amplified faster than wisdom. And the text's warning is clear: this pattern leads to catastrophe. The Nephilim, the hybrid offspring of the Watchers and human women, became monsters who consumed all resources and then began consuming humanity itself. The technologies and social structures built on forbidden knowledge created unsustainable inequality and violence. The earth itself became corrupted, requiring cleansing judgment. Whether this prophecy is coming true literally, whether AI systems will become the modern equivalent of the Nephilim, whether technological civilization is heading toward collapse, whether some form of judgment is imminent, remains uncertain. The Book of Enoch has been read as predicting imminent catastrophe for over 2,000 years, and catastrophe has been repeatedly deferred. Human civilization has survived technological transitions that seemed apocalyptic to those living through them. The atomic bomb has not yet destroyed the world. Genetic engineering has not yet created monsters. Perhaps AI will also be successfully constrained, its benefits preserved while its risks are managed. But the text's warning is not only about literal catastrophe. It is also about the moral and spiritual corruption that follows from pursuing power without wisdom, from building civilizations on knowledge that was gained through transgression, from allowing capabilities to exceed ethical development. Even if AI does not destroy civilization, its deployment in systems of surveillance, manipulation, and control represents a form of corruption, an amplification of existing injustices, a concentration of power in fewer hands, a reduction of human dignity and agency. Even if genetic engineering does not create literal monsters, its application in ways that reinforce inequality or commodify life represents a transgression against the natural order. Even if nuclear weapons are never used again, their existence and the systems built around them represent a fundamental corruption of international relations and human security. The Book of Enoch's prophecy, understood this way, is not primarily about predicting specific catastrophes, but about diagnosing the condition of civilizations built on forbidden knowledge. Such civilizations may endure for generations, may produce genuine benefits alongside their corruptions, may delay judgment through various forms of binding and constraint, but they remain fundamentally unstable, morally compromised, haunted by the knowledge that their foundation is transgression, and that this transgression will eventually require reckoning. You look up from your phone and out the window of your apartment. The city spreads before you, millions of people going about their daily lives, participating in systems they only partially understand, using technologies whose full implications remain unknown. Electric grids, financial networks, communication systems, supply chains, all of it functioning through a complexity that no single person comprehends. All of it dependent on knowledge that has accumulated over generations. Much of it developed originally for purposes of domination and control, but now repurposed for ordinary life. This is the world the Book of Enoch describes. A civilization built on the knowledge that the Watchers taught, using technologies that descend from their forbidden gifts, organized through structures that perpetuate the inequalities their teaching introduced. Yet it is also a world where people love and work and create, where children are raised and communities form, where meaning is made and beauty pursued despite the corruption that surrounds and permeates everything. The text does not tell you to stop participating in this world. It was written for people who had no choice, but to continue living within corrupted systems. What it does tell you is to remember that this is not the only possible world, that the current order is not natural or eternal, that the suffering and injustice you witness are not inevitable, but are consequences of specific transgressions that have been observed and will be judged. It tells you to maintain critical consciousness, to resist the ideologies that naturalize injustice, to preserve hope that transformation is possible, even when immediate change seems impossible. And it tells you that you are part of a long tradition of people who have held this awareness, who have preserved these warnings, who have maintained faith that the watchers will not triumph forever, that forbidden knowledge will not corrupt indefinitely, that judgment will come, and that when it does, those who preserve the memory of how things went wrong will help build something better from the ruins. Whether this prophecy is coming true in literal, dramatic ways, through AI catastrophe or environmental collapse or nuclear war, or whether it is coming true in the slower, more grinding ways that civilizational corruption usually manifests, is perhaps less important than the question of how you will live while holding this awareness. Will you withdraw like the Qumran community, maintaining purity while waiting for judgment? Will you proclaim like early Christians, announcing the coming transformation while building alternative communities? Will you preserve like Ethiopian Christians, maintaining the tradition and its wisdom even while engaging with the wider world? Or will you resist like 19th century reformers, organizing to overturn unjust structures while drawing hope from apocalyptic promises? The Book of Enoch does not answer this question for you. It simply insists that the question matters, that your choices have meaning within the larger drama, that the corruption you witness is not the final word. The watchers are bound, their knowledge persists, judgment is promised, and in the meantime, those who understand what has happened and what is coming have a role to play, not as passive victims or cynical beneficiaries, but as active participants in a story that began before the flood and continues into an uncertain, but not predetermined future. The prophecy remains open, its fulfillment dependent not only on divine judgment, but on human choices, on how each generation responds to the knowledge it has inherited, to the power it wields, to the injustice it witnesses. You set down your phone and sit in the growing darkness of your apartment, thinking about the scrolls in the caves of Qumran, about the scribes who copied them, about the centuries of preservation and loss and rediscovery. You think about the Ethiopian monks, maintaining the text through centuries, when it had vanished from European consciousness. You think about James Bruce carrying those manuscripts back to Britain, about Richard Lawrence publishing the first translation, about the Dead Sea Scrolls revealing the text's ancient importance, about scholars in the 1950s reading warnings about forbidden knowledge in the shadow of Hiroshima. And you think about yourself, reading these same warnings on a device that would have seemed like magic to any previous generation, powered by electricity generated from processes that split atoms or burn fossil fuels, connected to a global network that processes information on scales that dwarf human comprehension, participating in systems of knowledge and power that you only partially understand and cannot individually control. The Book of Enoch insists that this situation is not new, that every generation has faced some version of the same challenge: how to live with knowledge that exceeds wisdom, how to constrain power that lacks justice, how to maintain hope and moral clarity in the face of corruption that seems overwhelming. The text offers no easy answers, no simple formulas, no guaranteed happy endings. It offers only the insistence that the situation has been seen, that it matters, that judgment is coming, and that those who preserve this awareness participate in a resistance that transcends any particular historical moment. Whether the prophecy is coming true today, whether our generation faces the final reckoning, or simply another iteration of the recurring pattern, the text continues to speak. The watchers taught forbidden knowledge. Humanity inherited the consequences. The corruption spreads but is also constrained. Judgment is promised but delayed. And in the meantime, the question remains, how will you live, knowing what you know, having read what you have read, understanding that the current order is neither natural nor eternal? The Book of Enoch waits for your answer, as it has waited for every reader across 2 millennia. Patient and insistent, warning and promising, binding and releasing, ancient and urgently contemporary.